Moin Moin and welcome to Knowledge Enthusiast, in an attempt to make video titles a bit more appealing and to make the introduction a bit more less confusing. I have decided to not say or call these videos KE reacts or comments on, or say hey, welcome to Knowledge Enthusiast reacts or comments on, but rather hello and welcome to Ossi response to, in this case, what if the Central Powers won World War I? By What If Alt History, which means what if alternate history. And my name is Ossi. I'm 31 years old, former history student without degree and former video game journalist. I was born in East Germany but raised and now living in Hamburg. And this videos and this channel revolves around watching videos together and learning together. So I am not an expert. I have no real deep knowledge on the topics I talk about. I'm learning with you. I may have an understanding of basics, but that's it. I do not have a degree. I am not a teacher. I'm not a historian, and I'm just someone who's very interested in learning things, especially about history, because history is very, very interesting. And this means that sometimes things I say in the videos will be wrong or only scratching the surface. In that cases, you have the info text box, which will guide you through everything I say, or almost everything I say. If I manage to say something correct, then of course there is no need, except I think you need more information on that. So you find clarifications, you find additional information, and of course corrections there in the info text box. And if I mess up things there in the info text box, you also find corrections in the video description. And I'm happy about every comment. If I get something wrong, tell me. If I don't correct it in the info text box or the video description. In the video description, you will also find a link to the original video. And yeah, let's more or less start. I won't start the video yet because let's just briefly talk about World War I. So the start of the 20th century is shaken by two world wars, one from 1914 to it's debatable, 1819. So the war ended in 1918, but the peace treaty was signed in 1919. And the other one from 1939 to 1945, which both wars had a real strong participation by Germany. Some would say both were started by Germany, which is, if you watched my oversimplified video on World War I, not exactly correct, because World War I was not started by Germany, but highly influenced by Germany. And let's make one thing clear here. There is no way whatsoever that Germany could have won World War II. World War II was a loss from beginning to end. There are slight chances, like off chances, that Germany could have won if things would have played out differently, but they had to play out way differently, like the Allies attacking Russia, which actually was a plan, but was discovered by the Germans and then made public, and then the British and the Russians talked about it and came to the conclusion that they're very, very sorry, and nothing else happened. So would Russia have joined the war with Germany against the Allies, the picture might have been different, but that is a very, 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 very far stretched off chance. In World War I, on the other hand, the chances for Germany were actually way better. And even today, and even by sources from America or Great Britain, at the start of 1918, Germany could have won the war. Why? Because on the one hand, they made very, very good grounds with the Russians, and then forcing them to a peace treaty, gaining a huge portion of land, and then being able to concentrate all the forces on the Western Front, which also had the British and the French with mutinies, with one British general was told that the British were standing against the wall, and he was, as it's told, he then turned around, looked at the channel, and said, "What bloody wall?" And so the role the Americans played in the First World War might be overlooked today, but at that time might have been crucial for the victory of the Germans. And there were other ways to win the war as well. So, and you have to remember that at the start of 1918, Germany was still in France. So the war had not reached home soil on any front. And especially they had more or less Belgium occupied, and they had part of France occupied. They had the Hindenburg Line, which was a very, very strong defense that the Allies only breached with the help of the Americans in the late months of the war, which then led to the peace treaty. And they would have more defenses even behind that. So if there wouldn't have been the entry of the Americans in the war and the revolution that happened, which led to the Kaiser or Emperor abdicating or being forced to abdicate, or in reality it was like the new government just said that he abdicated. He didn't actually abdicate. Then his own soldiers on the front where he was stopped following his orders, and then he fled to the Netherlands and abdicated. But it's a bit confusing. He wouldn't have abdicated otherwise, I think. He was more or less forced to, and yeah. So, and now let's make predictions what this video might be about. I haven't seen it yet. So my predictions are, of course, Germany in short term would have gained a lot land, all the land they had in Russia. I'm not quite sure if they would actually have taken more lands from the French than they already had, and I'm not even sure if they would have taken that land. Why? Because during the Unification Wars and the Franco-German War in 1871, the Germans were actually they had Paris, and they had a huge portion of northern France, and they did not claim it, except from Alsace-Lorraine, which was German for most of its time, so it was okay. And the reasoning behind this by Otto von Bismarck was that if they would take a huge portion of the French land, then of course the French would be sour about it, and maybe they would start World War II. And I mean, that was not the reasoning by Otto von Bismarck, but that's the reasoning now that I bring up, why Germany might have just retreated and taken the victory without land gain. Maybe a small portion, maybe some provinces in the border region, but not more than that. And just to do not provoke the French anymore. And that would also mean that, of course, the Second World War wouldn't have happened, or at least not in the sense that it did happen with German aggression, because there wouldn't have been German rise to power by the Nazis, because they only could rise to power because of the so-called Dolchstoßlegende, which is German for knife stabbing legend, which was a legend that first came up by a German general. I think it was von Moltke, something like that, and just said that Germany would have won the war if the German population wouldn't have stabbed them in the back which was later then changed to if the Jews don't stab the Germans in the back, because those that were leading the revolution was the SPD, which is the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And Social Democrats were, at least at that time, communists. And the Nazis thought of some kind of Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. So they wouldn't have rise to power. Even the emperor might have still have been the emperor, and Germany would have solidified its status as the greatest superpower ever in Europe, which might have caused tensions with others, especially with the British, the Russians, and the French, but might have, I don't know. So that's my main two predictions. No World War II, and not that much land gains for Germany, but huge land gains, which even would rapidly increase the possibilities that Germany would have. So let's start the video. We're already at 12 minutes, or more or less. So yeah, let's not babble on too long here.
If I had to make a ranking of the most important wars in history, World War I would be a serious competitor for the first place. World War I was the culmination of over 1,000 years of European history, of the military competition between the different European powers, trying to become the next Roman Empire and killing each.
Yeah, this is, again, we all know of the Holy Roman Empire. And we all know of the initial Roman Empire, which lasted for, what was it, like 400, at least the Western European Empire, for like 400, 500 years after Christ, and again 300, 400 years before Christ. So let's say around about 1,000 years. And what they achieved was could still be felt even today, or maybe not so much today, but to this point, because as you see, of course, Kaiser is derived from the Latin Caesar, which then derives from Gaius Julius Caesar, but later emperors would call themselves Caesar. And the Holy Roman Empire, the predecessor of Germany, was meant to be the continuation of the Roman Empire. Then you had Italy, especially later on Mussolini, who, of course, saw themselves as the true heirs of the Roman Empire because they had Rome. And Italy is orientating an empire to recreate the glory of Rome and the Italian race. Yeah. So they had their ambitions to recreate the Roman Empire in its glory because it's their heritage. In that case, it really is their heritage. Then flag derived from Roman Empire and ruling family ex-Holy Roman Empire. Yes, the Habsburg monarchy that ruled over the Holy Roman Empire for 300 years until they dissolved it. Do not fall for the trap. Napoleon did not dissolve the Holy Roman Empire. It was the Holy Roman Empire who did it because of the losses to Napoleon, but he did it. Then, yeah, Tsar, the Russian emperor, was called Tsar, which also is derived from Caesar. And they're also Orthodox and took on the faith of the Byzantines later on, which never were called Byzantines, but that's a story for another time. Then one of the titles as Roman or Sultan of the Romans, yeah, because the later called Byzantine Empire had huge land here in this area. At the start, it also had all these area here, and they themselves saw themselves as Romans and the true Roman Empire, which also caused tensions between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, but then again, that's a story for another time. Any French history book of this era will bang it into your head that France is the true heir to Rome. Once again, because Gallia or Gaul, which was a huge part of the true original Roman Empire, and then we have Britain is the future, is the furtherance of the progressive democracy of ancient Roman Athens. Yeah, that's more like more or less than a claim than all the others have. But it's still a claim, and still what my point is, you see that in most cases in Europe at that time, and even stronger before, everyone saw themselves as some kind of continuation of Rome or highly influenced of Rome, and Rome had still a very, very strong grasp on Europe, even almost 1,500 years after its dissolution.
Between the different European powers, trying to become the next Roman Empire and killing each other while at the same time sparking technological innovation. At the same time, it also set the direction for much of the next 100 years. Directly or indirectly, it resulted in the Soviet Union, the Great Depression, the Second World War, decolonization, the Cold War, and American hegemony. Thus, if you were to change the effects of the First World War, you would change most of the direction of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's also something that often gets overlooked, that the First World War was not only the war to end all wars or the greatest war. No, it also, everything mostly bad that happened in the 20th century was a direct or at least indirect result of this World War. Because, as we all know, the Second World War is directly a follow-up to the First World War, and without the First World War, it maybe would have never started. The Russian Revolution, which we just made a few videos about, which you can see here on the channel with the simplified response, also is highly influenced by the First World War. It started because of, not only because of the First World War, but highly influenced because of it, because war is bad. The Great Depression, of course, hyperinflation in Germany and in Russia, the Cold War as a continuation of the Second World War or a result of the Second World War, and the Russian Revolution, and so on and so on. So you could also argue, if the First World War would never happen, the world would have been very, very different today. But again, it was inevitable. The First World War was inevitable. The Second World War not so much. The Second World War was only inevitable because of the First World War and the peace treaty that the Allies forced upon the Central Powers.
The Second World War, decolonization, the Cold War, and American hegemony. Thus, if you were to change the effects of the First World War, you would change most of the direction of the 20th century in general. So, what would have happened if the First World War had gone the opposite way? What if the Kaiser's Germany had won? How would that have affected borders, demographics, culture, wars in the modern world? That is the question of this alternate history.
We just made it to the intro.
Before we start, a brief word from one of our sponsors. Buddy Panda is a very new counterfactual YouTube channel. Rather than talking about history, they discuss questions like, what would happen to the world if humans suddenly vanished? Or what if nations stopped existing? Like this channel, they go into some really interesting side effects you never would have thought of. Check out this new quality member of the counterfactual community by clicking the link in the description. World War I was a remarkably close-fought war, and there were several points in which the Central Powers, or Germany, if we're being real, was very close to total victory. In general, with Russia knocked out of the war and Britain Island, a German victory would have come in the form of the Seizure of Paris. There were 2 points in which this almost occurred. with the German army only a stone's throw away from the French capital. The first of which was in 1914, and the second in 1918. Both of these are plausible places from which the Germans could win the war. However, I'm going to go with a German victory in 1918.
Yeah, so in 1914, Germany, after they more or less defeated Belgium, because Belgium put on a really good fight, which slowed the German advance so much that even the British were able to arrive in France and mobilize and stuff like that. And but they were in the end defeated, as we all know, and Germany marched into France. So during the unification wars, Germany actually did take France, and they wanted to repeat this again. You have to know that Germany's pure strength and advantage against anyone else was their focus on the so-called Bewegungskrieg, or moving war. So like you will see later in the Second World War with the Blitzkrieg, Germany always was destined to or eager to have moving troops, have their troops moving, have them flanking, have the enemy in best case on the run. And Stellungskrieg, or what we then call trench warfare, was highly against their philosophy. And in the moving warfare, Germany was the biggest might on the continent, and even with Britain, because Britain mostly had the Royal Navy, and they were the kings of the seas, but they were not the kings of ground warfare, and the French even less so. So they marched into the French on French soil, and they got their Bewegungskrieg, they got their moving war, and they moved and moved and moved because the Allies were retreating. And while on the border of Paris, and as we all know from World War II, if Paris falls, the whole country falls. It's something that is very unique to France, I think, because if you take Berlin, then no, Germany won't fall, because it has plenty of other cities lying around with almost equal importance. If you take Moscow, Russia won't fall, because it's a fucking huge country and has still plenty of country left. If you catch Canberra in Australia, then Australia won't give up, because you have still the whole outback and stuff. If you catch Washington, no. But if you can catch Berlin, yes, not Berlin, Paris, yes, then France will fall. And it was only when they were really short on Paris that the officers ordered to stop retreating and fight back, which then led to the Germans having to retreat some more, because all these advances did decrease their number, because they were still fighting and they were still losing troops. And you could also pretty easily fortify Paris if you wanted to. And in 1918, when Russia was out of the war, then Germany moved around 500,000 troops to the Western Front, had 1 million more troops than the French and the British, which had around 2.5 million, and the Germans had 3.5 millions at the front lines. And they advanced again, and they again came close to Paris, but then the Americans showed up in higher numbers, and they were able to repel the Germans, push them back, and then finally, after 4 years of war, they could breach the Hindenburg line. So yeah, this is the 2 times that Germany was in sight of Paris.
Germans could win the war. However, I'm going to go with the German victory in 1918. This is because everyone was still optimistic in 1914. Well, in 1918, everyone was a walking corpse. Having a 1914 point of departure and ending...
The cultural effects of World War One were far greater than the political. The Western social and intellectual code that had existed for centuries was shattered by the leadership fucking up the war so badly. World War One combined with the Holocaust resulted in Western civilization losing complete faith in its own worth and abilities. This has resulted in the decline of religion, the rise of social justice, the rise of authoritarian dictatorships, less racism, lower class cultures such as rock and roll, rap, jeans, etc. If World War One had never happened, the West would be very different. Yeah, you can agree to that.
Everyone was a walking corpse. Having a 1914 point of departure and ending the war a couple of years earlier would have gotten rid of all of World War I's effects on Western civilization as a whole, rather than merely just having a German victory. That's a separate video. Similarly, all the great powers were still capable of fighting in 1914. The French, with their entire code of heroism, would have likely moved their capital to Bordeaux and kept fighting with Paris lost. Similarly, Britain would keep its normal game of still fighting to keep the continent from becoming unified that it always does. In 1918, everyone was still barely functioning. If Germany had seized Paris, the British and the French would have immediately given up, creating a cleaner victory for me to work with. The biggest way to allow the Germans to win 1918 would be to prevent America from entering the war. It's a hugely controversial argument over whether America turned the tide of the war, but it almost certainly did. To list some effects, the entrance of America into the war is what broke the French army's mutiny. The US troops were the last line of defense that kept the Germans from winning their spring 1918 Kaiserschlocked Offensive, an offensive that was done on desperate timing to try to wipe out France before the US could enter the war. It was widely known that once the US was able to fully mobilize, it could quickly outnumber all the other powers on the Western Front, and thus the arrival of Americans in mass number was a big reason Germany surrendered.
Yeah, so we still have to remember that Germany did not surrender because in World War II Germany surrendered because there was no Germany anymore. The Allies were closing in from all directions. Berlin has fallen, the whole Rhine area has fallen. Northern Germany has fallen, southern Germany has fallen. There were only maybe a few spaces left which were not yet occupied by the Allies. In World War One, the war would never reach German soil, at least not modern Germany. It reached Eastern Prussia, but that was with the Battle of Tannenberg, really quickly repelled and even pushed back into Russian territory. So there was no real urge to surrender if the Americans wouldn't have entered the war, because Germany's soil was still untouched, and they had the upper hand on every front. They were on French soil, they were on Russian soil, they were even on together with the Austro-Hungarians on the Italian soil. So no one was closing in. Yes, the offensive of the Allies would eventually have reached German soil, but under high casualties. As I said, behind the Hindenburg line, which was still in France, if I remember correctly, there would be even more lines of defense, and then a huge river with the Rhine, which they would have to cross to reach the mainland of Germany. They would have the industrial heartland with the Rhineland, or at least the left side of the Rhineland. But from there on, it would be even harder, and the British and French didn't have the numbers for that. And if I remember correctly, the French were so desperate they didn't even have any reserves anymore, and they were able to managing their divisions because they changed the numbers in it. So they made the divisions smaller and stuff like that. And they were really against the wall, which also was true for the Germans, which had a higher population and still would have had even more reserves. But there were the sea blockage by the British, which the German Navy, the second best at that time, would never breach. They would never even really attempt to breach it, because they had their 10 dreadnoughts, but they were not using it for whatever reason. Maybe because they were highly expensive, but you could have just scratched them entirely from the beginning. Just don't build them, and maybe focus more on U-boats, or to have money to buy food from other sources, maybe from Sweden or Finland, because the naval blockade by the British was, I think, only in the North Sea. Could be that they only also had them in the Baltic Sea, but I'm not entirely sure. I think Germany would have be able to get some food from there if they could afford it, and if, of course, the other countries would let them, which is debatable, because Russia did not have any food and was their enemy just prior, and Finland was a part of Russia at that time, and Sweden was neutral. So I don't know, but the possibility may have been there, and yeah. And yes, we see here, this is also a reason why Germany was winning the war, because they just had more men. Especially if the British wouldn't have entered, if they just would have taken on the French defense line on the German-Franco border, then the British would have joined eventually, but maybe way later, when France was already defeated, because French just had not enough men compared to the Germans. They would have taken more losses initially at the defenses, but once they would be overcome, Germany would still have more soldiers than France, and would transit into the moving warfare, which they were excellent at, and would have defeated France, which would have even have happened maybe before the British would have entered. And then they could concentrate on the Eastern Front and defeat Russia as well, which might have taken then some kind of land, because the Russian attack on Tannenberg was the reason for the Germans to move some divisions from the Western to the Eastern Front, even though the Russian army was repelled at Tannenberg by a force of, what was it, like 12,000 men against 120,000 men or something like that, which were defeated, and most of them were even taken prisoners. So just keep those men there, get some help from the Austro-Hungarians and maybe even the Ottomans, and organize the front a little bit better, and just to stall the Russians. They can take some soil, but you focus on the Western Front and then on the Eastern Front. But a two-front war with high numbers of troops, even Germany couldn't afford that for long. And even though they did, this is once again showing how much power the German army had on the land battles, because they did fight a 4-year-long two-front warfare with almost no help. On the Western Front, no help. The Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans were only focusing on their side of the map. The Western Front was Germany all alone. The Eastern Front was with Austria-Hungary and in some parts the Ottomans in the south, but they weren't good, and they were overrun by the Russians, more or less. The only ones who were really advancing in the Eastern Front was Germany. So Germany fought a two-front war with high numbers of military and also with high casualties. and still was able to almost win the war. You have to imagine that. So that's why I say it was very much possible for Germany to win the war, which it wasn't in Second World War, but in First World War, they have to mess up to eventually lose it, which they did in the end, and which brought the Americans into the war, which then helped the Allies so much, even though the troops weren't really trained, but it helped so much that they then, and only then, were able to defeat the Germans.
Once the US was able to fully mobilize, it could quickly outnumber all the other powers on the Western Front, and thus the arrival of Americans in mass number was a big reason Germany surrendered. The United States had a naturally isolationistic temperament in this era. If Germany had not maintained submarine warfare, which actually did not seem to have turned the tide of the war, as well as the completely idiotic Zimmerman telegram to Mexico.
For those who don't know, the Zimmerman telegram was when Germany sent an invitation to Mexico to declare war on the US and in return give them some southwestern states. The British caught it and sent it over to America, which was the primary reason for the declaration of war against Germany. This was really dumb since Mexico was a failed state in the middle of a civil war without a central government. If Mexico had declared war on America, the US could crush it in a matter of months. Yeah, that's two main reasons why the Zimmerman depeche was dumb. But there is also another one. First, or a few more. First, don't send it before the US actually joins the war, because there was a chance that if this telegram would arrive in Mexico, that the Mexicans would just show it to America, and then America enters the war. But more stupid than that is that Zimmerman himself just said, yes, it's true. So the British intercepted the telegram, showed it to the Americans. At this point, you just imagine, at this point, Germany could have just denied it and say that the British have made it up. Then America wouldn't have such a strong argument to enter the war, and maybe Congress wouldn't decide to go to war and wouldn't approve. But then Zimmerman comes out of hiding. No, I didn't come out of hiding, but you know what I mean. Stands there and just says, yes, it's true. I sent this telegram. Which is stupid, because just deny it. Just deny it. You know it's intercepted. You get asked, and then you just say, yes, it's correct. It was me. I sent this with this intention. Please declare war on us. It's
to turn the tide of the war, as well as the completely idiotic Zimmerman telegram to Mexico. The US would never have joined the war against Germany. The warmongering President Woodrow Wilson would have been overruled by the isolationist Republicans controlling Congress. Without the US in the war, the Germans would never have been in a rush to use their new troops, freed up by the defeat of Russia, to immediately wipe out Paris. Instead, they'd be able to wear down the Allies' attacks by fighting.
Tanks are a complicating factor since they gave the Allies a large offensive edge. The Germans did make tanks in our timeline, and if the Allies were successful with them, like every other invention of the war, the Germans would have replicated it. Yeah, so we still have to remember, as I said in my video on World War I with Oversimplified, tanks at this point were... Tanks had a huge role in World War II because they were more developed. They were 20 years since the First World War. In World War II, they had a very, very minor role. They were more for intimidating factors. They didn't have high enough numbers. They broke down very easily and stuff like that. So... which is why the Germans did not really care too much about replicating the tanks and building their own tanks and countering with tanks, which they would do later once tanks improved. But and they see the opportunities there. the possibilities. But in World War One, this was not on their to-do list. And yeah, because they would. So in 1917, in I think April 1917, the US declared war on Germany. From that point on, the US mobilizes 1 million men, which are sent to Europe and arrive in around October of 1917. But at that point, they're not that good equipped, they're not that good trained, and stuff like that. So there is still a possibility. They're there, but they're not ready to fight yet. At least not in dangerous in a dangerous capacity. So the Germans just said, okay, before even more troops come and before they get trained better and stuff like that, we now have to make our move. We now have to take Paris to end this war, which was totally unnecessary. I think, in my opinion, they had 500,000 fresh troops from the Eastern Front, and they still had reserves that they might have conscripted. And if they would just hold their lines and maybe make slight pushes, not these desperate pushes with all the forces, all the resources, then even with the US in the war, they would have had a chance. Of course, the longer the war would rage on, the more American troops would arrive, because, as we just saw, America had even more possible soldiers than Germany, Britain, and France, maybe even combined, possibly. And yeah, it would have been less of a chance if America didn't enter at all, or if they would win. But it was a gamble. It was one of the many, many, many gambles.
To immediately wipe out Paris. Instead, they'd be able to wear down the Allies' attacks by fighting a defensive campaign and then launch brutal counterattacks, causing enormous damage to the British and then seizing Paris from the French. With both France and Britain bled to the bone, they would surrender to German conditions. World War I was a horrifying war in which the population suffered a huge amount, and unlike many wars in history, the public's opinion actually mattered.
Yeah, because it was a total war, and in a total war, the public is fighting the war as well. And if they stop helping you, then you have a problem. Which, for example, in Great Britain, you had the whole suffragettes movement, because the men were fighting in the war. The women would all take over their jobs and would more or less run the entire military manufacturing industry. And then they striked because they wanted voting rights. They so even though it was not, I'm not an expert on that. But I think it was not in that great scale, so that the industry of Great Britain was completely blank. But it would be high enough to at least slow the process that Britain could produce things like armory and shells and helmets and stuff like that, munition, more importantly. And in Germany, we also have the situation that the public of Germany was more and more against the war, because they too lost their husbands, their fathers, their sons, and they were at some point having none of it. And even at that point, with these offensives, if the Germans would have then just have gone to the French or the British and said, okay, surrender now and the war ends, they maybe just to rise the possibilities, they didn't even need to come up with some kind of terms that would be seen harsh. They could just say, okay, accept our new borders in the east, which was all this territory here, accept that we won, and we do not take blame for the start of the war, and we will retreat our troops from France and Belgium. Maybe put some in bordering territory, like I said in the beginning. And I think, again, I wasn't there, and I can't speak for French government, I can't speak for the British government, but this sounds reasonable. I, for one, at that point, in that situation, I would take it. Even though the Americans would arrive sooner or later and would be a striking force sooner or later, if you take that much of losses, if you still are fighting on your own soil and your own population is hungry and tired of war as well, then just take it. Just sit there, say, yes, it was a great war, let's end it. Because in Germany we say, lieber die Taube in der Hand als der Spatz auf dem Dach. Nee, andersrum. Lieber den Spatz in der Hand als die Taube auf dem Dach, which means I like some kind of nice bird in my hand more than the dove on my roof, which you just forget about that. It just means I take what I can get. So even though there is something shiny or something nice in reach, but not in immediate reach, but I have to do something to reach it, then I take that what I already have in my hand, which would in that case be a peace term with not that much humiliation like the Russians would, for example, would have accepted, which they did accept, but all these new countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were Russia and were for a very, very brief term German. And when Germany lost, then this territory would become their own country. So Russia didn't even get that back.
A huge amount, and unlike many wars in history, the public's opinion actually mattered. Thus, the defeat terms came out really brutal for both sides, since the public demanded revenge for all their dead sons, brothers, and comrades.
Okay.
That's why the Versailles Treaty of our timeline was so brutal. Germany would likely enact a similar treaty, with the enemy empires likely divided in a manner similar to this map. In our timeline, slight choices in the Versailles Treaty affected politics decades down the road, and so we'll go through the important border shifts to see what would happen. Starting in the West, the Germans supported the Irish Easter Rising, and in an attempt to reward their allies and weaken the British, would give the entirety of Ireland to the Irish rebels. The enormous difference in wealth and the religious divide mean that the Catholics would oppress the majority Protestant population of the North. The Protestants would form their own militias and terrorist forces to resist the Catholics, while migrating en masse number to likely Australia or more so Canada, making an even more Scottish region. Germany would push its border west, seizing wealthy and port-heavy Belgium, while pushing its border a bit west into France as well.
That's what I said in the beginning. I'm not sure if Germany would have done that. Okay, let's be clear. Otto von Bismarck was one of a kind, and he was a brilliant strategist, and he understood the geopolitical political dangers and opportunities of his time. So he did not make the decision to seize French soil. They would occupy it for a bit, just until France would have paid their reparations, but they would not seize as much, except from Alsace-Lorraine, as I said. So, and the leading figures in World War I were more stupid, let's say so. So there is a possibility that they wouldn't take the same approach as Bismarck did, which they didn't in the East. But I think in the West they might have, because like in the real timeline, when Ferdinand Foch, which was a French general, which is one of the great heroes of the World War and responsible for the victory, walked out of the signing of the peace treaty, he said, "This is not a peace. This is an armistice for 20 years." And even they did see that. So I think some Germans would have seen that as well, and maybe would have said, okay, let's not take that much land, and even especially don't take Belgium. Belgium was neutral and didn't allow the German troops to pass, so the Germans occupied it and then passed their troops through. But don't keep it. Don't give it back to the Belgians, because as a sign of goodwill, if you want so. Maybe have the fortified border region seized, maybe a few kilometers inland, so you can fortify it better if France would attack Germany, but not the whole territory they controlled at that time. At least that would be what I would have done. As I said, the Germans at that time might have done it.
Seizing wealthy and port-heavy Belgium while pushing its border a bit west into France as well. However, the largest changes would be in the east. It's surprisingly obscure among the normal population, but Germany had taken over most of Eastern Europe from the Russians in the final years of World War I. They had to give it up due to the peace treaty, but it was a huge region. The Germans were planning on settling this region and turning it into a German economic colony.
Yeah, we have to remember those regions are more or less perfect for agriculture. You have even more ports on the Baltic Sea, which goes pretty much to the extent that the Hanseatic League once had. And if you're interested in that, you can just watch my video on the Hanseatic League, which I created last week. From this point on, I think. Anyway, and this was 1/4 of the Russian population and 1/4 of their industrial land. So it was a very rich region. And as I said in the beginning, it would have made Germany far more prosperous, I think. Even more than they already were.
Germans were planning on settling this region and turning it into a German economic colony. The Kaiser's Germany wasn't a nice state by any margin, but it didn't have the genocidal tendencies of the later Nazis. The Germans would likely succeed at this by migrating many Germans east and integrating the economy of Eastern Europe into Germany. This would drastically increase Germany's resources and size as a power.
The Germans, or the Holy Roman Empire, so for more than 1,000 years, Germany was a multi-ethical, multinational empire. I'm struggling with using the word empire, but let's, for the sake of argument, just say it was an empire, and it was a multinational one, as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they I think, at least, I mean, the times where we all know what the Russians did with the Russification and with persecution of the Jews and stuff like that, and the Germans later on too. But I think the Germans at that time were not that racist. They were not that anti-Semitic. They would have allowed the settlers there to stay there, and they wouldn't even have to change that much in the regions, because, as I said, from the Hanseatic League onwards, most of this territory for a lot of time was at least Germanic, or Scandinavic, which also is Germanic, but you know what I mean. And so the cultural differences might be not that big of a deal. That would more be a problem down here. But yeah, when the yellow things would be settlements, which were, I think, parts of the land, especially here where we already have settlements of former Germans and Prussians and stuff. So yeah, I think they wouldn't have been that bad to the people already inhabiting these areas, and maybe even the people that already did inhabit these areas would even see some kind of nice new government with the Germans compared to Russia, because these regions were Russian and these regions were very, very hungry and very, very poor. So maybe Germany would have changed their life for the better. I'm not glorifying Germany here. It's just Germany at that point would have been, at least in my opinion, the better government compared to Russia, especially under the Tsar, but also under communism. Not saying that the Russians wouldn't at some point say, let's try to conquer it back. But that's a story that for another time, I think, or for maybe later here in this video.
Succeeded this by migrating many Germans east and integrating the economy of Eastern Europe into Germany. This would drastically increase Germany's resources and size as a power. Meanwhile, the Germans had only slightly less ambitious claims for their colonial empire. They wanted to combine their colonies in Tanzania and Cameroon to make a Mittel Africa, which would involve taking land from the Belgian Congo and French Gabon, and possibly even British North Rhodesia and Nyasaland. The Japanese were part of the Allies, but at heart opportunists, who were allies since Britain and France were the preeminent naval powers in their region. However, if the Allied cause was falling apart, they would immediately shift to the Central Powers and use it as an opportunity to poach the weaker colonies off them. Japan would seize French Indochina and Hong Kong in the final months of the war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would be in a bit of a pickle. It was already too big for its own boots, with countless ethnic groups that were trying to secede, but it was also surrounded by dangerous neighbors that could only be kept down by force. For example, Serbia, which is an independent power funded terrorism, would have to be kept in line by force. Venice and Italy would likely be militarily
This is very hypothetical what he's now talking about. I mean, the whole video is hypothetical, but I think this is very hypothetical. For example, I don't think that Japan would have switched side. The alliance between Japan and Britain was formed even before the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. So, which is one of the reasons why Japan felt strong in attacking the Russians. I think Japan would just have kept the islands and the dominion on Chinese soil that they would have occupied, because there was no greater power in the area who could stop them. The Germans would have to send all their navy across the entire planet to do something about it, whereas the Japanese were still rapidly industrializing and pumping up their military. So I could even imagine that Germany would have just said, okay, keep the regions, but pay us back in some form. Or make an alliance with us in some form, so you can protect all this. For the African colonies, yes, I see that Germany would maybe then seize colonies from the British and Belgians and combine their own colonies, which again was to actually the plan. I think they would just abandon the colonies in the East Pacific, or the West Pacific, in the Pacific, since they would not be able to claim it back, because the others around there would be the Americans, the British, the French, which wouldn't interfere in and take them back for Germany. I don't think that would happen at all. Germany wouldn't be able to conquer them back, so just leave it be and have some reparations for it. And yeah, let's see what Italy is about.
Terrorism would have to be kept in line by force. Venice and Italy would likely be militarily occupied by Austria for several years before returning it to Italy. This would be solved by giving Bulgaria, a member of the Central Powers, a whacking big chunk of the Balkans and create a greater Bulgaria so they could hold down as much land as they could. Austro-Hungary would militarily occupy Romania and parts of Serbia to keep them subservient while trying to split and divide and conquer, perhaps splitting Romania between Wallachia and Moldova.
So, just to be clear, in this alternate history timeline, not only Germany would win, but also the Ottoman Empire would win, and the Austro-Hungarians would win, which, as we know, did surrender before Germany. So Germany were the last that were fighting. The Ottoman Empire was almost ceasing to exist pretty much when the war started, when Lawrence of Arabia came around and just steamrolled from the south through it from the south. I think the Ottoman Empire would still have dissolved, even if they would have won. The war would have shown them that the empire is not as strong and not as stable, and before breaking apart in another war, for example, they might dissolve into nation states like they actually did, and try to work together from that state on, but be maybe less vulnerable to outside affairs. The same kind of would have happened with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because Austria-Hungary maybe would have stayed together, as well as Czechoslovakia, or previously known as Bohemia, because they belonged together for far longer than you could imagine, even when the Holy Roman Empire was still a thing. But the whole war started with independence, with the claim of, or because of Serbians and others would seek independence in the southern regions, which were culturally and historically way far away from the original Austria, Bohemia, Hungary and stuff. So maybe they would still try to break away, and maybe the Austrians would let them. I don't know. There would be a new emperor on the throne, because Franz Joseph died in 1916, I think, was it? And maybe that new emperor would have followed a different approach on the empire.
Split and divide and conquer, perhaps splitting Romania between Wallachia and Moldova. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had a great division between the regions run by the Austrians and the Hungarians. This is why the Poles, who were under Austrian rule, viewed it as one of their golden ages, while the Croats, under Hungarian rule, viewed it as an era of pain and oppression. The Austrian part of the empire generally wanted to democratize and spread power among the ethnic minorities, while the Hungarians viewed this as an attack upon their honor. After the weakness of the empire had been shown by the war, the Austrians would have pushed the empire to civil war against the Hungarians over reforming it. A civil war the Germans would involve themselves in order to support their puppet. Austro-Hungary would reform with the German army as the main thing preventing the state from falling apart. The Ottoman Empire is like a runner who made it so close to the end goal, but then passed out and died 5 feet before the finish line. This is because the nation was reforming, actually quite effectively before World War I, and becoming a modern country. Also, the empire was just about to discover an enormous deposit of oil under their territory. The immense amount of oil in this territory would allow the Ottoman state to survive and even fund Turkey's industrialization. Turkey might have succumbed to Dutch disease, in which a natural resource ruins your economy, but I honestly think the Young Turks would have reinvested it into the military and economy, thus making Turkey a much greater power. With Russia in dissolution due to its civil war, the Turks would have pressed further into the Caucasus, like they did in our timeline, seizing modern Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Chechnya. Without the Russians to protect them in eastern Armenia, the Armenians would be driven to near extinction by the Turks, with only their diaspora surviving. Russia is a hard call. It seems easy to imagine that Germans would have intervened in the civil war between the communists and non-communists by helping the non-communists win.
But why would they do that? It is believed that the Germans even supported the communists in creating the revolution, although it is just watch my video on the especially part 2 on the Russian Revolution from Oversimplified, which some kind of explains that there is a lot of misconception here. Also with sending Lenin to Petrograd to create chaos. Germany itself had some kind of communist revolution in 1918 in the real timeline, 1919, with the Spartacus uprising. And this wouldn't have happened in this timeline, of course. So they might be not that afraid of communism. And maybe even because communism still is a German invention, and maybe they think, okay, they admire a German, so maybe the communists would work with us better. Also, the communists were the ones they made peace with, and because of all that happened around with Trotsky proposing no peace, no war. Which led to even harsher terms and even more territory seized by the Germans. They see the communists as the weak force. So I could imagine they wouldn't support the whites, they would support the communists because in their opinion, in German opinion, the communists are the ones who are easier to be swayed. I could be wrong here, but I think that would be the mindset after what actually happened in this timeline as well, and the circumstances why Russia left the war.
Civil war between the communists and non-communists by helping the non-communists win. However, I think after fighting such a bloody and horrifying war as World War I, that the Germans would be content with consolidating the wealthier part of Russia rather than invading Russia again to disturb the balance of power in the Civil War. They would also possibly think that there was less a chance the communists would be as strongly anti-German as the Russian nationalists that dominated the anti-communists. The Soviet Union would still exist in this world. Reparations were the done thing in this era, with the wars of German unification being the prime example of this. In fact, the US not placing reparations on Germany and Japan after World War II was a bit of a shock. Thus, Germany would likely request financial payments from Britain and France as onerous as those levied on Germany in our world. With a colonial empire and reparations, Germany would become a fabulously wealthy nation, with Cologne or Frankfurt likely becoming financial centers as big or bigger than New York.
So even more so than it actually did. We don't forget, Germany is one of the major powerhouses today, and it was throughout more or less the whole 20th century. It was before World War one of the most powerful nations in the world. It was for a brief period of about 13 years after World War One on the ground, but then rose again, and within a few years with under Hitler, it became a powerhouse again. Then it declined again, and then it rose to power again in the 1950s, and being a global powerhouse from there on, with being the most or the richest country within Europe since like 1956 or something. And so imagine that, but like double or triple that, with all the colonies that Germany would still have, which still would, I think, fight for independence at some point, but with all the new territory they have, with all the new wealth they have, that would be a very, very, very dangerous Germany, I think. It would be on par with the US, I think, even with the US today.
Or Frankfurt likely becoming financial centers as big or bigger than New York. By the end of the First World War, in real terms, Germany was a military dictatorship, with the Kaiser losing more and more power to generals like Falkenhayn and Hindenburg. With the return of peace, things would likely return more to normal. A bizarre political system would likely develop, one that's hard to describe in our timeline's terminology since it hasn't really existed. The military and traditional aristocracy it represented would gain an enormous degree of power, while the emperor and parliament would maintain a certain degree. The economy would become more directed.
I always feel like there are all sorts of political ideologies that could have been widely popular if they picked up enough steam. For example, Christian socialism. It was a popular movement around the turn of the 20th century, but since the Marxists were so adamant about atheism, it was sidelined. However, the vast majority of people in Western societies were devout Christians, and the heart of Christian message as Jesus preached is quite socialist, which with an enormous emphasis on donations to the poor and society structure and compression are rather profit. Similarly, a right-wing state with big government seems quite plausible. A state with big government to support the people and national glory, and thus social spending to maintain social cohesion and traditional values. As I said, there was the communist uprising in 1919 and the German November Revolution, and the following smaller revolutions were more or less exploited and initialized by left-wing parties. So there was a strong left-wing movement. But the thing is, these movement took their fuel from the tiredness of war, from the loss of the war, and later on the extreme right movement would take their fuel from the loss as well, giving the left wing the blame for it. I don't think what political movement would be flourish in Germany. There is a high possibility that yes, the emperor would still be the emperor, and even might remove some power from the military again. But as he said, they took even more and more power during the war. And we all know that military is not that keen on giving up war. It could also be possible that monarchy would be abolished, like it was in the real timeline. Maybe even on Russian with Russian with Russia as a role model. A more constitutional monarchy would also be possible, like in Great Britain. What do I think? What was the mindset of people if they won the war and live in a prosperous? They live in a prosperous country. They're not poor. They have, like all things like healthcare and insurances were implemented long before the war by Otto von Bismarck. So they are more or less happy. Happy people do not tend to lean to any extremist movements. So Christian socialism, like it is today, like the ruling power, the more or less ruling party today, is the Christian socialists together with the social democrats. So I think, yeah, central with a slight lean to left, maybe, because nationalism is wouldn't have been that great of a thing. The whole nationalist movement was when Germany unified, and then they were happy, and then when they were not happy with the Nazis. I don't think there is much strife for a nationalist. Maybe some kind of nationalist prime. I think it would have gone more or less the same way than in the US, with more patriotism, more national identity, but still more or less democratic, more or less, yeah, like central. Even the two biggest political powers in the US are more or less central parties. One is more left, one is more right, but they have to appeal to the whole public, so they are of course central, because central appeals to the most. And that's where I end this excursion.
Well, the emperor and parliament would maintain a certain degree. The economy would become more directed, and more of a welfare state would be created due to the war's example of what big government was capable of. However, this would not be a left-wing state. It would be a strongly conservative, nationalist, right-wing one.
Maybe.
The Great Depression would still have happened.
Recession are caused by this balance between our expectations of the economy, the stock market, and the actual economy. This happens when too much of the world economy is placed into a single field, and that field is incapable of delivering on the expectations. This happened in 2008 when too much expectation was placed on the American housing market, while the industrialization had in real terms eroded the average American's terms to buy a house. The Great Depression was caused by too much expectation being placed on industrial Americans' economy, while most of the rest of the world's economy was in decay due to the collapse of the late 19th century system of globalization and the decline of the standard of the living in Europe. Due to reparation and debt payments, Britain and France would decay economically, thus creating too much pressure on the German or American economies. Keynesians have this bizarre argument that wars can kickstart an economy. This isn't true. More wars have ended in recessions than economic booms. Wars led to recessions when the wars shrink the total size of the world economy by dividing the world system or economically repressing the defeated side. World War I, Napoleonic Wars. Wars can lead to economic booms either when the victor exploits the defeated side to expand their economy, Punic Wars and Franco-Prussian War, or by creating a global system by which all can thrive. World War II and Pax Romana. Yeah, that's true. Of course, for some nations like the US, with all the war industry going on, wars can kickstart an economy. But most likely, because to have an economy, you need people. And wars have the tendency to get rid of a lot of people in a short time. And those you do not get rid of by the war itself. They die because all the food, as I said in my video in part 2 to the Russian Revolution, food is the most important thing. That's why in war times all the supplies you have go to the military, because if they're hungry, they are not fighting for you, and of course they're losing and may turn against you. So you make sure all the food goes to the military. All that's left can go to your public, which in a total war is more devastating, because you also have to make sure that your public is eating, which means less food for the military and less food for the public, which is a very, very weak balance, and tends to destroy the whole economy, because then you also have strikes and you have to re-embark all this economic growth and all these food supplies after the war, which of course is easier for the winning side, but only if you are still in a state to make this happen rather quickly. If you win the war but have spent so much resources that it would take years to actually get on your foot again, like it was in France and partly in Britain, which also saw a decay after the World War I. If we read here, then no, more economic downturn. There are only a few examples on which the at least the victors could kickstart their economy and could rise to superpowers by a war, but normally it leaves all sides devastated.
The Great Depression would still have happened for reasons quite complex that I didn't have the time to explain since this isn't an econ channel, but if you care, pause on this. Either the Cologne or New York stock markets would collapse with a worldwide recession.
I really hate how economists only focus on the last 50 years, which have been a bizarre historical aberration caused by the Pax Americana. and technological growth and project that into the future. One of the main flaws of our era in history, which could possibly lead to a collapse, is that we assumed we are above the rules of history since our era of history is special. Yeah, that's true. Which is, but this is more a philosophy that you have in the US. I think it's not that widespread in Europe. For example, I as a German do not feel that my government or anyone in the economy thinks they are above history. But Germany is a special case because we care a whole lot about history, because we shaped history for a long time, especially in the 20th century, and we are still today feeling the consequences of 2 world wars, even though our economy is great. But I think all the rulers in Germany know that this might come to a collapse sooner or later, and are still preparing for that. But I'm not an expert on that topic. But I don't think that they think the era of history is special. I don't think this is also true for France or Scandinavia or something. I think it's mostly in the US, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yes. Either the Cologne or New York stock markets would collapse with a worldwide recession. Similarly to our timeline's Germany, Britain and France had faced the brunt of it, with them struggling to pay off the reparations while maintaining their economies. World War I was so traumatizing that the nations that won faced existential crises, while the nations that lost, or even thought they lost, became horrifying tyrannies. A good side of this would be that Germany would have maintained a much more humane government under the Kaiser without having lost the war. Interesting side note, without the Nazis, a huge amount of Jewish talent would have never fled to the US. Figures like Henry Kissinger, Albert Einstein, and likely others would have served the Reich. Japan turned authoritarian partially since they thought...
But we also have to stress that all these Scientologists who then fled Germany and made great innovations would still... So the innovations they made, we all know about them, like the theory of relativity by Albert Einstein is world known, and I think he even made this while still in Europe, but I'm not entirely sure. So the brain drain was really devastating for Germany in terms of war efforts, because you have these people who went, for example, to the US, like Otto Hahn and Albert Einstein, who helped then creating the atom bomb. Which, would they have stayed in Germany, Germany could create an atom bomb, but there would be no reason, because the whole atomic Project Manhattan, was pushed with war in mind, because there was a war, a very big war. So if Germany would have had a stable, humane government, there would not have been those war efforts. So there would have not been the need for scientists to focus on how can we win the war with new inventions. This doesn't mean that these inventions wouldn't have made otherwise. I think they would have been made at some point, but maybe not that soon. Maybe even at a time when humanity had a better understanding of how devastating like an atom bomb could really be, and limiting them from the start. Which again, the arms race between the Soviet Union and the US was with a war in mind. No arms race, or no Cold War, no need for an arms race, and more likely to have less numbers of atom bombs. But of course, we only know how devastating atom bombs are because they were dropped, so you win some, you lose some.
likely others would have served the Reich. Japan turned authoritarian partially since they thought they deserved more colonies and respect from the white powers for being a great nation and their service in the First World War. Also, their relatively small size and need to import all their natural resources really hurt them in the Great Depression. Thus, in this timeline, the rise of the military to complete dominance of government would never have taken place, with the power balance between the army, parliament, and emperor. Sort of like Thailand, I guess. The bad side of all of this is that Britain and France would probably turn fascist or nationalist. As a rule, when they pick authoritarian governments, developed nations go for fascism, while primitive ones go for communism. However, the essence of fascism is that it pulls in the native folkways of the country it's in.
In general, if you know how one communist regime behaves, although there is a certain degree of variation, you can predict how other communist regimes behave. Communist regimes conduct purges of anti-communists, followed by different groups that could challenge the leaderships. They then collectivize the land and go through a famine, close their borders to the outside world, build a cult of personality, and remain generally militarily isolationist except if there is a threat moderately close to the borders. This is really strange since communism has existed in nearly every continent among wildly different geographies and cultures, with the common thread being the teachings of Marx. Fascism has no central profit and is all about nationalism and pulling on local traditions. This is why Franco was very isolationist and Hitler was very imperialist. Japan and Germany were genocidal, while no such tendencies existed among Spanish and Italy. For example, although Japan is often considered fascist, it in reality behaved more like an industrialized feudal state, with the aristocracy mostly in charge rather than a party. I do not agree. At least not with the first part, because yes, we see how communist regimes behave, but there is only, or at that point, there was only one communist regime, which was Russia or the Soviet Union, and all others followed suit under Russian influence, with maybe even tied to Russia. So there is no real communism or communist regime that arose without any influence by the Leninist Marxists or the Stalinist Marxists or even Trotskyians. You have to understand, communism, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels was written and published in 1848, which was a year of revolution and was picked on by many people. And what you actually can see independent in every communist utopia predecessor-like state is that communist parties form and split because of the interpretation. Like in the church, when you have Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, which all have the same faith, more or less, but different opinions how to live those faith. The same goes for communism. So you have the hardliners, which then go on to become those that we knew today as Marxists. But you also have people like social democrats, which are still a ruling factor, for example, in Germany, and have been for a very, very long time. They even seized the power after World War I, as I said earlier, but were not seen as that communist. Not anymore. They were actually the SPD, that is ruling Germany, or together with the CDU today, was at one point forbidden by Otto von Bismarck with a law that has a very long name, but basically says that socialism is the spread of evil. Literally. I will put it in the info text box. It literally says that it's a great danger. And socialism is kind of a communist way you can go. Then you have other ways. So there is no unified communism, but those regimes that rose up and made all the same mistakes were more or less centralized because they all followed the same faith of communism, which is the Leninist Marxist or Stalinist Marxist communism. Because like in Cuba, they had Russia as their role model because Russia were the first. And you also see that communist regimes then can tend to go different ways, like in China, which when you compare the Soviet communism with the Chinese communism, there are plenty of differences. And even today, China is going more in an approach of being a socialistic or more socialistic country, meaning that they have some tendencies of capitalism, even though they're still communist, and so on and so on. So there is no bad communism that you can outline. It's just they all were influenced by the Russians. Fascism, on the other hand, has many faces as well. And I think were there really no atrocities or something like that in Spain or Italy? I mean, the Franco Spain isn't that be depicted as a very, very bad time for the people? I have to do research on that. I know nothing about Franco Spain, but I think he was a little bit genocidal as well, but I'm not sure about it. And the reason why Germany was genocidal was more or less not because of nationalism, but because of the previously mentioned Durchstoßlegende, which was a huge center of the propaganda of the Nazis, and they made the Jews responsible for that, as well as all the communists and socialists and like everyone they didn't think would be great for them when ruling. So even though the British and French would become more nationalist, I don't think that would lead to them being more genocidal. Maybe towards Germans living in those areas because of the war, but
However, the essence of fascism is that it pulls in the native folkways of the country it's in, and thus has a greater degree of internal variation inside fascism than communism. There's this alternate history series written by Harry Turtledove, where the South wins the Civil War and the American South becomes a fascist dictatorship. He just copy and pasted the Nazis, which seems pretty lazy since there's a large degree of
I'm not saying America could never become fascist. I really hate the argument that blah 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 country is too civilized for dictatorship, since throughout the history of the world, the most advanced and civilized societies like Rome, France, and China have been capable of falling into dictatorships that did horrible things. However, America is a really bizarre culture that's way outside of standard deviation, and so an American take on fascism would likely be quite strange and interesting to watch. There is actually an experiment that was conducted, and the book written with the experiment in mind, which is called Die Wave, or in German Die Welle. And there is also a movie about that, which depicts the question, could Germany become nationalistic dictatorship again? And the short answer is yes. It could. The long answer is because, especially in civilized nations, you have the tendency of the public to obey the law, and if the law says be nationalistic, then there would be a great deal of people who would follow that, especially if you have a charismatic leader. And you wouldn't even notice, you wouldn't even think of, oh, we were just becoming a nationalistic, fascist, people holocausting nation. You would just think, okay, this person is great, I will follow him because he is charismatic and he does things I think are good for me. Because again, like in Hitler Germany, most of the people didn't even know about the Holocaust, at least not in the extent that it actually was conducted. So you have this charismatic leader. Then this charismatic leader says, okay, and now we are a unity. We share the same values. We are a unity, and the people on themselves would likely become more excluding, and everyone who is not in their unity could be the victim of, for example, mobbing or attacks, or even worse. And so you have this core of people who follow their leader and his philosophy without even knowing that they're just drifting away in bad terms. And then they begin oppressing the others. And by the others now have the choice to join, some of which will, even though they might not follow the philosophy, but they don't want to be bullied or excluded as well. And others wouldn't, but they would still be repelled and maybe flee, or just stop being against it, or stop openly being against it, like it actually happened in history on both sides, fascism and communism. And now you have even more people, even more power, and suddenly you're a dictatorship, which is not necessarily bad. There are examples for dictators who did good things. I don't know of any, but you have to see that technically every king, every emperor is more or less a dictator, because usually, especially in the Middle Ages and times like that, there's one person who has all the power, especially in autocracies, or in like Louis XIV. He had all the power, and people would have to do what he says, because they are civilized, and they have to obey the law, and they will obey the law, which is one of the reasons why in the German Basic Law, or the Grundgesetz, or the German Constitution, there is actually a paragraph that every German citizen is obeyed to do anything they can against dictatorships. So the German people actually are obeyed by law to uprise against dictatorships and anyone who seeks to seize power to become a dictatorship and stuff like that. Or in short terms, everyone who is anti-constitutional. We have to fight them, which is basically in our constitution. And even though this is in the constitution, we have to, if no one fights it, then, because either no one notices, or by the time they notice, it's too late, because it would be suicidal. So
he just copy and pasted the Nazis, which seems pretty lazy since there's a large degree of variation inside the fascist world, and an American take on fascism would almost certainly be different from a German one. France had a strong conservative, monarchist, Catholic, militarist, nationalist movement always bubbling slightly underneath the surface. This could have seized power if France was humiliated by Germany, with France becoming exceptionally reactionary and militaristic, with possibly them putting a relative of the Bonapartes on the throne in order to recreate Napoleon's glory. Britain's long history as a democracy means I'm not sure if they'd become a full fascist or totalitarian state. However, democracies can often become tyrannies of the masses, with a hard-right party being elected to continually win elections and maintaining power, propagating illiberal results, sort of similar to Narendra Modi's India today. They would likely maintain British nationalism, the glory of the empire, the need to maintain the honor of the Anglo-Saxon race. Britain, France, and Russia would all have enormous grievances against the Germans, with emotionally important regions of their empires taken from them that they would need to reconquer. They would all form an alliance against the German Central Powers. For all of these reasons above, there would still be a World War II.
Which is why I would say it would be only logical to not seize that much land, especially not from France or Great Britain. So, like Ireland, I would never even consider that the Germans would have any influence over Ireland. They would just leave it be, and maybe they supported the civil war there for the Catholics, but they wouldn't do anything about it. So they would not occupy the land, and I think they still wouldn't occupy most of Belgium and France, and maybe even giving some territory back to the Russians in exchange for maybe an alliance just to prevent the war. So the means of preventing it are pretty much there. Germany did not start World War II to regain lost territory. That was not the goal of the war. It was one of the reasons stated by the Nazi Party, but it was not the goal. And I think it wasn't even a real reason either. It's just there was so much else at play there. Maybe the only thing I could imagine would be the Polish corridor that was splitting German soil in two, which was actually that way for a long time in history. So even that is an argument, but not a very strong one. And if Germany would just say, okay, we give you back a little bit of land which belonged to you, or not seizing it in the first place, then World War II wouldn't have happened in the sense they will depict it now here, I think.
For all of these reasons above, there would still be a World War II, albeit different from our worlds. With the last war being so closely fought, the Turks would have likely stayed neutral and tried to supply oil to both sides, but it's possible they could have been dragged into the war at a later date to the Central Powers' side. Japan, run by moderates and less by insane militarists who felt the need to keep invading for national glory, would not have gotten involved in the greater European war, and instead would have concerned themselves with the conquest of China. The Russians, French, and British would launch a large offensive on Germany. It's difficult to predict the war in its totality, but when all is said and done, a few variables would lead to a German victory. Firstly, Germany would have an enormous size advantage. Most of Eastern Europe and the wealthiest and most populous regions of Russia, alongside the Low Countries, would be in German hands. The Germans were nearly able to go toe-to-toe with the Western powers in both world wars in our timeline as just Germany, and so giving them more territory would make them even more powerful. Secondly, it seems unlikely the United States would have gotten involved in the war. The US has an enormous preference for the UK as an ally due to the ancestral and cultural affiliation. With the UK as an aggressive militaristic state, it would turn off the naturally isolationist America. Similarly, without Hitler as rabid...
As much as America doesn't like the view of this way, if Hitler hadn't declared war on America, the US likely wouldn't have fought Germany. Hitler did it to get support from the Japanese and discounted the Americans as a dangerous foe, viewing them as racially inferior due to miscegenation. Okay. It is debatable. Germany was still an ally of Japan, even so. If Germany wouldn't declare war on the US as a kind of nice gesture for the Japanese, Germany would still have sunk even American ships that would try to reach Britain. It would still be a very dangerous and holocaustic, if that is even a word, country. And as I said, in one of my last videos, the US actually did know, as well as the other European powers, they did know about the Holocaust. So maybe it would prolong the entry to the war in Europe, but it wouldn't have prevented it. I think the US would declare war sooner or later. Less so now in this alternate timeline, when the Britons and the Francos and the Russians would be the aggressors, because being on the side of the aggressors is never a good view in global scheme of things. And America at that point was still a country, a very fairly new country that took a bit of pride in how others see them. So they wouldn't do anything that would make them look bad. At least not right now.
It would turn off the naturally isolationist America. Similarly, without Hitler's rabid racial views, the Germans would have not declared war on America like they did in our timeline. The US would likely not fight a war against the Japanese because, since the Netherlands would be surrounded by Germany, it seems highly likely the Netherlands would be a German puppet state. The main source of oil in the Far East comes from Indonesia, which was a Dutch colony. Since the Germans and Japanese would likely be allies, if the US passed an anti-trade deal against Japan, the Germans in Indonesia would likely have ignored it, and Japan would not feel the need to declare war on America for oil. The Japanese would likely seize Malaysia, a British colony, but would expend most of their energies into the conquest of China. They'd likely be able to conquer China proper, as many numerically inferior invaders like the Mongols and Manchus were able to do when China was disorganized. However, it seems likely that, like all these regimes, a less racist and ideological Japanese occupying force would have assimilated to Chinese culture over several generations. Meanwhile, to jump to another front, the Soviets were so brutal that the amount of collaborators in our timeline who worked with the Germans, especially early in the war, was quite large. However, they quickly realized the Nazis were worse than the communists. This would not be the case in this timeline, with the Kaiser much more humane than the Nazis, leading to a lack of morale among the Russian defenders. European Russia would likely collapse and become a German satellite. Some Soviets would flee east of the Urals and create a communist regime in Siberia. Europe would likely develop like this after the war. The Germans would crush the British and French while being able to turn European Russia into a satellite. They would likely try to exploit Europe for Germany's benefit, while at the same time not infuriating the European powers enough for them to not cooperate.
At this point, I would even argue that if Germany would have been so stretched with this thin corridor and this mostly German nation to the south, they would at some point just annex or ask the Austro-Hungarians if they want to join the party, and finally have the Großdeutsche Lösung, which is the great German solution, which was already around when Germany unified, with them taking the Kleindeutsche solution, or the small German solution, which was without Austria, but there were still tendencies in Austria to join the German Empire, even after World War One, even after World War Two. I think there was a petition or an election which barely ruled this out, which was already ruled out by the Axis, by the Allies, which made it illegal for Austria to join Germany, which wouldn't have happened in this timeline. So maybe even Germany would be much bigger, because this looks just stupid. It looks a bit like Germany was shot. Like, imagine this as a head with here Pickelhaube, and Germany was shot in the head, and blood is spilling out from everywhere behind. I don't think so. I think they would then go on and occupy Austria-Hungary. And what would Austria-Hungary do against it? At this point, Germany would be the largest power in the world, I think, which is unlikely to happen. I again don't think this would happen this way. I think Germany would focus on diplomatic ties between its neighbors, maybe even pulling off some of the reparations from England and France, and just saying, okay, quid pro quo or something. Maybe even giving back some land to the Russians, or some support to the Russians to develop. Maybe they could also just annex everything. It's also a possibility, but I would like to think of the Germans at that point, without fascist movements and things like that, that they would be more humane and in a geopolitical sense more reluctant to seize world power domination, stuff like that.
While at the same time not infuriating the European powers enough for them to not cooperate. Thus, they would create a sort of European Union of mutual cooperation based out of any of the cities the EU is based out of in our timeline for geographic reasons, with Germany as the presiding power. Asia would turn into a Japanese imperium, becoming a more benign version of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. I have no idea what would occur with decolonization. The United States would have fought in neither World War. It would have remained an isolationist power, which the US is honestly capable of doing due to its incredible geographic advantages, except for Latin America, of course. The US will intervene there. Once Britain would become part of the German-European Union, the ex-British settler societies like Australia, Canada, or New Zealand would immediately become American allies. The world would in general look like this. Some people say that a world in which the Central Powers had won World War I would be better. I'm not sure. There are strengths and weaknesses to both worlds. What do you think? Is this a better or worse world than the one we live in? Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Or alternatively, check out Buddy Panda's YouTube channel by clicking the link in front of you to see more hypothetical scenarios. As always, have a great day, and thanks for watching. If I had to make a...
Yeah, that was of course a very interesting video. I do not agree with everything said in it. Please let me know in the comments what you think. If they are right, if they made some mistakes or things like that. So I would imagine that yes, Germany would, if the Central Powers would have won World War One, some of the things he depicted would still happen, like the Great Repression, which would then struggle more then would lead to the British and the French struggling more. In our timeline, the Germans did struggle because they had the reparations and they had the hyperinflation and the economic downturn and stuff like that. I would also not see too harsh terms for the Allies in the peace treaty. Yes, the terms on Germany were hard because of the population demanding revenge, which would still be a factor in Germany as well, but also they would be more cautious, I think, and trying to prevent such a war from happening again. They can still explain that later on the German people. And I think there were also British and French officials who did disagree with the treaty. And of course, Woodrow Wilson was famously not really liking it. And yeah, I would also not think that much that the Americans would stay out of any world war, even though they wouldn't be attacked. And I don't think that the Japanese wouldn't develop some sense of genocidal nationalism, because that developed after World War One, still, with them being a victor, and with them being a victor again in their depiction here, because they would join the Central Powers side at the end of the war, according to their depictions. So they would even win more, and even maybe think of them more of a supreme power, which would then lead to even more imperialistic ambitions and racial superior view of themselves. I agree that they wouldn't attack Pearl Harbor, but not because they are not that genocidal or something, but because America wouldn't have had such a big and huge, strong navy or naval force, and especially not all tied up in Pearl Harbor. Because without the entry in the First World War, America wouldn't rise to be a superpower that fast, and especially not in artillery production and armory production. So their focus wouldn't be that much on military like it is today, like it was right before World War II, and especially in World War II. So yeah, and again, I don't think that Germany would seize that much land. It's just when you look at the history of Germany, this would be very anticlimactic. It would be unlikely. It would be not their philosophy. Yeah, seizing land, but piece by piece, usually in small pieces. So I don't know. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you liked the video or not. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video, and maybe tell me even why in the comments, or leave a thumbs down and tell me why you did that. And take a look at all my other videos. I have seen your suggestions about ancient Rome and ancient Greek in 20 minutes and 17 minutes, and I will do those. I am recording this video just slightly after you made the comments, so it will take a while until they are released, but I will do them not right next, but I think the video after the next video will be on ancient Greece, and then 2 or 3 videos later will be on ancient Rome. So stay tuned for that. But the next video will be again by Sam Onella about the historical what was it, warfare machines thingies. Let me just look if I have written down the title. Creative Weapons of Medieval Times. Yep, that's the title, or more or less the title. So that will be the next video, and when I have the sheet open, after that we have ancient Greece, and then World War II Part 1 by Oversimplified. Yeah, at least that's the plan for now. But if you want to see me commenting or replying to another video, just let me know. This video is now very long and with only 17 minutes of original video. So let's end it here, and have a good night, have a good day. Bye bye, and see you next time.